August 29th, 2015. Okay, so we'll start with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. And good morning to all of you out there. Okay, so today we will be taking Sutta number 138 in the Majjhima Nikaya. And this is a sutta, it's an interesting sutta because we'll see the text, it's a little bit problematic. Okay, so the sutta is called Uddesavibhanga Sutta. Here it's translated the exposition of a summary, but Uddesavibhanga could also be taken as, in Pali it's called a dvanda compound, which means translated as a dual compound. It could also, that means it could also be translated a summary and an exposition. But for Vibhanga, actually, I think that was the word that Venerable Nyanamoli had used, but I think the better word is analysis, because Vibhanga comes from V. So one of the implications of V is division or separation, and bhanjati means something like breaking up. So breaking up into divisions is like an analysis rather than an exposition. Okay, so the sutta begins when the Buddha is living in Shravasti in Jeta's Grove, and then he addresses the monks. This is what's the interesting part. He says, I shall teach you a summary and an analysis or exposition. Listen and attend closely to what I shall say. So the monks say, yes, Bhante. Then the Buddha says, okay, let's just skip over. The Buddha makes the summary, the short statement, paragraph 3. Okay, then paragraph 4, it says, that is what the Blessed One said. Having said this, he rose up from his seat and went into his dwelling. Yeah, so the Buddha says, I'm going to teach you an analysis, a summary and an analysis. Then he recites the summary, then he gets up and he's gone. So what are we going to make of this?
That's fine. One paragraph.
Okay, so, excuse me? I see, because the Buddha's microphone fell off. Okay, so this is the summary statement, the Uddesa, the brief statement. So he says, and it's quite, you'll see it's a quite high teaching. So the Buddha says that a monk should examine things in such a way that while he is examining them, his consciousness, his vijnana, is not distracted and scattered externally, nor, here we rendered this, nor stuck internally, but maybe that's a little bit too strong. Maybe I would say not settled or established internally. And by not clinging, he does not become agitated. If his consciousness is not distracted and scattered externally, nor settled or fixed or stuck internally, and if by not clinging he does not become agitated, then for him there is no origination of dukkha, or suffering, of birth, aging, and death in the future. So maybe, I don't know, we could only conjecture why the Buddha should say, I'll teach you the summary and an analysis, and then speaks only the summary, and then departs. And I remember, in fact, I should present this problem, because I based on Venerable Analayo, when comparing the different versions of Sutta number, I think it was 133, I said, based on Venerable Analayo, that the Chinese version of this sutta was superior to the Pali version, because in the Chinese version, the Buddha says, I will teach you, I don't remember exactly. No, my memory is a little vague about what I said. But the point that Venerable Analayo made, I think, was that the Chinese version was better because the Buddha says, I will teach you the summary and the exposition. And in the Pali version, after speaking the summary, he gets up and departs. Whereas in the Chinese version, he speaks both the summary and the exposition. Okay, but so I said that seemed to be a puzzle and somewhat inconsistent in the Pali version. But here we meet the same thing. Actually, there's a Chinese parallel to this, and both the Chinese and the Pali are in agreement that the Buddha says, I'll teach the summary and the exposition. He teaches only the summary and gets up and leaves without giving the analysis. Okay, so this is the summary, and now after the Buddha goes, this is a problem that comes up every now and again when the Buddha just gives a short statement. The monks are sort of perplexed, and they say, who will expound this in detail? And then usually when they're in this dilemma, they turn to a monk called Mahā Kaccāna. Mahā Kaccāna was praised by the Buddha, or he was actually appointed to the position of the monk who is foremost in giving detailed expositions of short statements of the Buddha. And so when the monks are wondering who will expound this in detail, then they consider that the venerable Mahā Kaccāna is praised by the teacher, he's esteemed by his fellow monks, he's able to expound the detailed meaning, and then they decide to go to him. And what's omitted here is a stock passage that comes in quite a number of suttas. Whenever the monks go to Mahā Kaccāna, or sometimes they go to Ananda and say, please explain this in detail, then Mahā Kaccāna says, oh, you're making a big mistake. You were in the presence of the Buddha. You could have asked him the meaning. Of course, the passage doesn't say, but he got up and went into his dwelling. But you were in the presence of the Buddha. You could have asked him the meaning. Why should you come to a sort of foolish, unlearned person like myself? This is just as if a man were to enter the forest seeking hardwood, and then he would cut down a big tree, but he would pass over the trunk and then just go to the twigs and the leaves and take them away, thinking this is hardwood. And so just in the same way, when you were in the presence of the Buddha, you passed over the Buddha himself, who is like the hardwood, and you come to me when I'm just like the twigs and the leaves. But the monks insist, and then Mahā Kaccāna agrees to speak. Okay, so now Mahā Kaccāna is going to explain the meaning of the Buddha's short statement. Okay, so he starts off, even though in this short statement, the Buddha spoke about how the monk who is examining, for the monk who's examining things, his consciousness is not distracted and scattered externally. But in order to make clear exactly what's meant, Mahā Kaccāna has to backtrack in a way and explain what is meant by saying that somebody's consciousness is distracted and scattered externally. Okay, the note just says that this consciousness is distracted externally when it occurs by way of attachment towards an external object. But let's see the exact wording of the text. Okay, so it says, here, and it's speaking with reference to a monk, because this is part of the training of a monk. So he says, when a monk has seen a form with the eye, if his consciousness follows after the sign of form, if his consciousness is tied and shackled by by gratification in the sign of form, is fettered by the fetter of gratification in the sign of form, then his consciousness is said to be distracted and scattered externally. Let me use the Pali words here. Okay, what's interesting, first, usually in passages like this, the text will speak about the citta, but here it uses the word vijnanam, which is translated consciousness. They both have pretty much the same meaning, but usually when the Buddha is speaking about training oneself, he refers to the citta as the object of training rather than vijnana. Here, the word vijnana is used. I don't read any great significance into this. It's probably just, call this eloquent variation. Okay, then we have the word vikitang. I explained before that you saw it, the prefix vi sometimes has the sense of separated, and kitang means thrown. So this is being thrown, you could say, in different directions. And there's a noun related to this, vikepa, which is what we translate distraction. So this is generally, the problem that we meet with in everyday life as well as in meditation. When one sits down to meditate, then the mind, what comes into the mind are memories of forms, experiences, other people, and the mind, we're trying to focus on a single object to make the mind ekaggata, one-pointed, unified, but the mind is vikitang, thrown in different directions or distracted. Then visatang, again it's the prefix vi, separate, and the past participle satang is based on the verb sarati, which means to go. So this is gone in different directions. Satang, Sanskrit sritang, it's related to we have sarana, buddhang saranang gacchami, I go for refuge. I think sarana is based on the same verb. Okay, so satang is to run or to go, and to go in different directions. So the mind, or in this case consciousness, is scattered. So it's distracted and scattered. It's thrown in different directions, it runs in different directions. And what is it thrown towards? What does it run towards? Here, when a monk has seen a form with his with the eye, if his consciousness follows after the sign of forms, is tied and shackled by gratification in the sign of forms. And then the sub-commentary, I have the note on this, says that the form itself is called the sign of forms, in that it is the cause for the arising of defilements. I'm not so sure that I agree completely with this in saying that the form itself is the sign of form, but rather what I take to be the meaning, this is the expression rupa nimitta. So rupa is the form, nimitta is a sign or a mark, but I take this rather to be that the nimitta is, you could say, the significance that one ascribes to the form, or the way one sort of superimposes upon the bare sense object a certain significance, certain meaning, certain projections, things that one projects upon the bare sense object. So then the bare sense object comes to mean something more than just the object in itself, but it takes on a kind of aroma of subjectivity. In other words, there's some kind of projection of one's own interests, concerns, worries, attachments onto the form, so that the form ceases to be just a visible form, but it becomes a form with a certain meaning or significance that provokes an attachment to it. So the consciousness follows after the sign of forms. Okay, so like an example, this comes in the explanation of sense restraint. So the monk sees a form with the eye, and the example that's always given is seeing the form of a woman. Okay, so if one has sense restraint, it doesn't mean that one just closes the eyes or puts blinders on, but when one sees the form of the woman, then one just stays with the form. It's just a form. But if one nimitta gahi, one grasps upon the sign or the mark, that means one starts projecting onto it some kind of what I call subjective significance. Ah, that's a beautiful woman. Oh, what lovely hair. What a bright smile. What a nice figure. And then from that, a kind of interest starts to arise. And then from the interest there comes desire or lust. And then the mind gets overwhelmed by passion. So that would be a case of following after the sign of forms. But if one doesn't follow after the sign of forms, it doesn't mean that one stops seeing altogether, stops hearing, but one doesn't project that kind of significance onto forms, sounds, other flavors. If, for example, one is eating food, today I want Punjabi food. Today I want Sichuan food. Today I want Turkish delight. Or today I want some Sri Lankan curries. And so one keeps on sort of getting attached to tastes. Okay, so if the consciousness follows after the sign of form, and then we have is tied and shackled to the sign, to gratification in the sign of forms. Here, this is another important word, asada. Asada, that's what's rendered here as gratification. The original meaning, excuse me? Too low? I'm standing in front. Okay. Okay, asada is what's translated as gratification. The original meaning is something like sweet taste. But it doesn't apply only, it's not referring only to foods. It's the sweet taste, the enjoyment that can come through any sense modality. And often the word asada comes in a set of three terms. We've gone through this quite a few times. Asada is the enjoyment, then that is followed by the adinava, which is the danger or the deficiency in the object. And then there is the nisarana, the escape or release from the object. That is the removal of desire and lust. Okay, but here the text only uses the word asada. the gratification, the enjoyment, the sweet taste or sweet flavor of form, sounds, the other sense objects. So we could say almost that there's a sequence here, that first the consciousness follows after the sign of forms, like it ascribes a certain what I call a significance, a subjective significance to the forms. It projects its own interest and desires out onto the form. Then that form acquires a significance, and then one starts to enjoy the form. And with that enjoyment, then the consciousness becomes tied and then shackled to the sign of forms. And then the text says that it is fettered by the fetter of gratification in the sign of forms. And here the word used, it's the familiar word for fetter, sangyojana. You know, often the texts speak about the 10 sangyojanas, the 10 fetters that have to be broken in order to achieve liberation. But here the word is using sangyojana in relation to the gratification in the sign of the sense objects. Okay, so this pattern is sort of unfolded or unpacked in relation to each of the 6 sense modalities. Sounds through the ear, odors through the nose, flavors through the tongue, tactile objects with the bodily touch, and purely mental objects with the mind. Okay, so that is how the consciousness is distracted and scattered externally. And then, now with paragraph 11, now Mahā Kaccāna comes to the actual word of the sutta itself, which is how consciousness is not distracted and scattered externally. And so it says that here, when a monk has seen a form with the eye, if his consciousness does not follow after the sign of form, is not tied and shackled by gratification in the sign of form, is not fettered by the fetter of gratification in the sign of form, then his consciousness is said to be not distracted and scattered externally. And then this is, again, it's elaborated in regard to the other 5 sense modalities. So now I'll ask any questions so far on what's covered, any questions on what has been covered so far.
The nimitta is based on perception, right? That's why it's always different for everyone, it's because obviously everyone's perception of an object
Of course, in order for there to be a nimitta, there has to be perception.
And you said in the Chinese suttas, they stated that the Buddha explained the sutta in addition to giving the summary?
Not in this one.
But in the Chinese version?
No, not in the Chinese in the Chinese version of this one, it's the same as in the Pali version. What I said is in another sutta, the Buddha says, in the Pali version, I will give a summary and an exposition. Then he recites the summary, then gets up and leaves. Then in the Chinese version, the Buddha spoke both the summary and the exposition. And then Venerable Analayo in his paper said that this shows that the Chinese version is superior because the Buddha here remains faithful to his original statement. And then when I was teaching the class, I said, this is a good finding by Venerable Analayo. But now we come to this sutta where both the Pali version and the Chinese, in both the Pali version and the Chinese version, the Buddha says, I will teach you a summary and an exposition. And he recites only the summary and then gets up and leaves without giving the exposition.
But then in the Chinese versions where the Buddha actually gave the exposition,
Yeah.
Mahā Kaccāna doesn't give an exposition.
I have to refresh my memory.
Was it time for coconut water? That's why the Buddha got it.
Yeah, maybe somebody came and said, Bhante, the coconut water is ready. Any other questions? Okay, so let us continue. Okay, so this takes care of the first part of the Buddha's statement. He says the consciousness, one should examine things in such a way that the consciousness is not distracted and scattered externally. And then he says, nor stuck internally. Okay, so now Mahā Kaccāna is going to picks up on the phrase not stuck or not settled internally. We're in paragraph 12 now. And first he begins with the negative case, the case where somebody's mind is stuck internally. And here he says, and how, friends, is the mind called stuck internally? And here he uses the word, actually, rather than, whereas the Buddha in the exposition was still using the word vijnana, as though vijnana is stuck internally. But when Mahā Kaccāna is explaining, he uses the word citta, cittang. And he says, how is the cittang santanti vuciti? How is the citta settled or stuck internally? Actually, often the Buddha praises having the mind cittang santitang. Like that is the stage of progress in other suttas when the mind has been disturbed by distracting thoughts. Then when one dispels and gets rid of those distracting thoughts, when the mind starts to settle in on its object, then the Buddha says that cittang santitang hoti, that the mind is now calmed down, settled down. It's become still and quiet and focused and unified. But here the word santitang is being used somewhat in a negative sense. So he says, how is the mind stuck internally or settled internally? And he expounds this by way of the jhanas. So first he gives the formula for the first jhana, that the mind is secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome mental states. The monk enters and dwells in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, with rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. So all of this is something positive and desirable, something to be praised, something to be aspired for, to be practiced for. Okay, but here's where the problem arises. If his consciousness follows after the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, is tied and shackled by gratification in the rapture and pleasure of seclusion, then his mind is said to be stuck internally. Actually, here there's a shift in wording from vijnana to citta, but it's not significant. It's just two different words with the same significance. Okay, but here what's being described is the situation where the mind becomes attached to this rapture and pleasure of the jhana. And so it becomes tied and shackled to that gratification in the rapture and pleasure of the jhana. So instead of using the jhana as a basis for progressing to insight and becoming detached even from the jhana, instead one takes delight in that jhana and becomes attached to it. Is that a squirrel that's come into the classroom? A dog. Your dog. Okay, it's good that he listens to the Dharma. There's a story, it comes in the commentaries. Back in the time of a previous Buddha, a monk was reciting the Abhidharma in a cave, and there were 500 bats in the cave. And they heard the Abhidhamma, and as a result of that, they became, in the time of Shakyamuni Buddha, they became the 500 pupils of Sariputta who specialized in the Abhidharma. So maybe this dog is going to become, in a future, under a future Buddha, a specialist in the Majjhima Nikaya. Okay, so this passage about the mind becoming tied and shackled by gratification, the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, this makes an interesting contrast with Sutta number 137, the one that we just took last week, where the Buddha speaks about, let me find it. Yeah, that would be page 1070, passage or paragraph number 16. The Buddha says, by depending and relying on the 6 kinds of joy based on renunciation, abandon and surmount the 6 kinds of joy based on the household life. So in other words, one can use the joy of the jhana or the pleasure and rapture accompanying the jhana. Initially, one should sort of enjoy that pleasure and happiness, that pleasure and rapture, because that becomes the way of discarding or overcoming the attachment, the interest in the joy pertaining to the worldly life. And so through the joy of the deeper meditative states, initially, I would say, don't become detached from it too quickly, but relish it, enjoy it, and use it as a means for overcoming the interest in, the attachment to, the joy or the enjoyments of the worldly life. But if one's mind follows after that rapture and pleasure, and then becomes tied and shackled to it, then it becomes a form of bondage. It's a higher kind of bondage than sensual desire. But this is becomes the fetter that ties one to the form realm, to the rupa dhatu, the realm of pure form. And so when one is tied and shackled to the enjoyment of the first jhana, then one is creating the karma that will lead to rebirth in the lowest level of the form realm. This is the realm of the Brahma divinities. And so one can, develop and attain that jhana and take rebirth in the form realm. But if one has the right view and understanding of the Dharma, then one can use even that rebirth to gain liberation. But people, meditators, become attached to the bliss and rapture of the jhana and then forget everything else, forget to go further, and then they become just tied to, in the human realm, tied to the experience of the jhana, and then when they get into are reborn in the divine realm, then they just remain trapped in that realm and can't break out of it. Okay, so then the same pattern is applied to each of the higher jhanas, going up till we get to paragraph 15. We'll just take this because it's a little different. So with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, and with the previous disappearance of joy and grief, a monk dwells in the fourth jhana, which has neither pain nor pleasure, and has purity of mindfulness due to equanimity. Okay, if his consciousness follows after that neither pain nor pleasure, this is the neutral feeling. It's a very, very pure neutral feeling, a feeling which is neither pleasant nor painful, but it's very, very peaceful, very tranquil feeling. And so the mind can also become shackled to that very peaceful, quiet, still, equanimous feeling of the fourth jhana. So then one becomes tied and shackled by gratification in that feeling, fettered by the fetter of gratification in that neither painful nor pleasant feeling. Then the mind is said to be settled or fixed internally. So if one becomes attached to that very peaceful feeling of the fourth jhana, that is creating the karma which is leading to rebirth in the fourth level, the highest level of the form realm. And again, if one has the right view of insight, one could let the mind be reborn there and use that insight in order to gain liberation in the form realm. But there's a danger that one will become sort of sucked into that peaceful feeling and intoxicated with it and deeply attached to it. And in that case, one forgets the insight of impermanence, dukkha, non-self, and then becomes sort of fixed upon that peaceful feeling and trapped in the form realm. Okay, so then we come to the counterpoint passage, how the mind is said to be not stuck internally, not settled internally. Again, one attains the first jhana, but in this case, the consciousness does not follow after the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, is not tied and shackled by gratification in that rapture and pleasure, is not fettered by the fetter of gratification in the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. In this way, his mind is said to be not stuck internally. Okay, so in this case and in the following, according to the following paragraphs, one attains the jhana and one experiences that pleasure and joy in the first jhana, the second, and also in the second jhana, in the third jhana, just the pleasure without the rapture. In the fourth jhana, one experiences that peaceful feeling accompanied by mindfulness and equanimity. But in each case, there is not the attachment and identification with that feeling, and so the mind is not fettered to that feeling, not shackled to it, but one is able to enter into that state. And because one understands that even this experience of the jhana is something conditioned, composite, dependently arisen, so it's impermanent, unsatisfactory, not self. And in that way, one doesn't become fettered to the experience of the jhana. Okay, any questions now at this point? Edwin, please take the microphone.
Would it be correct to say that when you practice in the first jhana, of course there's gratification, there's a nimitta, or whatever the case may be, there's form, or actually mental formation. But now, can you actually, when you practice in non-attachment, you actually practice in insight or vipassana, because you're actually looking at it as impermanent. So isn't that more going into like vipassana
I
at
see.
the same time?
Okay. Yeah. When I say that one understands that the jhana is impermanent, unsatisfactory, not self, I don't think at that point one necessarily has to be actually engaged in the insight contemplation of the jhana. But what I'm just saying is that one has this understanding, this view of the jhana as being impermanent and conditioned, impermanent, and so on. And so just on the basis of that understanding, one doesn't become fettered to it. But of course, if one goes further, and then based on that understanding, then one can practice insight on the jhana.
Right. Yeah. Would it be correct to say, even if you're on the first, second, or third, before you get to the fourth jhana, would it be correct to say that you could still go further, of course, and insight meditation or vipassana? Would it be correct to say you could do it from any of the jhanas?
Oh, one could do it with any of the
course, right,
jhanas, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other question? Somebody way in the back.
Good morning. Can you explain a little bit more about how to practice the jhanas or meditation in general without being attached to it? Because the reason why I ask this question is, I mean, if you're, like in my personal experience, if you're trying to pursue something, sometimes it's very easy to get attached to it. Like, if I want to eat this food, if I'm always picking things, is this gonna, I don't know when to differentiate between, like, this is my, like, craving,
Yeah.
or, like, this is just good for me. Whereas if you're a monk, everything's just given to you, so it's, I can see
Yeah.
why.
Yeah. I didn't quite get the last part of the question.
Well, like, if you're a monk, then things are given to you, so you just have to accept
Yeah.
them. But if you're a lay person, you're always, like, going after these things. So I wonder if there's a similarity between that and going after the jhanas in meditation.
It's a rather complex question. What I would say is that certainly, to make spiritual progress, then it's good to practice with the aim of reaching the jhanas. And initially, I'd say one doesn't have to be too concerned about becoming attached to the jhanas. because it's difficult enough, to make the effort to reach the jhana. So it sort of has to direct the mind fully to that. And then once the bliss and joy of the jhana, or even the lower stages of meditation arise, again I say, don't be worried that one is enjoying that pleasure and bliss, because this is a way of suffusing the mind with a higher type of pleasure that helps one to turn away from coarser, grosser types of pleasure, the pleasures of the senses. It's pretty much at a more advanced level that one then, after one becomes very familiarized with the pleasure and bliss of these higher states of meditation, that one sees that the attachment is setting into it, and then one has to use some means of either reflective contemplation or direct insight to remove that attachment. But initially, if we follow the pattern of Sutta number 137, one uses the pleasure or the joy of renunciation in order to overcome attachment to the joy of the pleasures of the worldly life. Then based on the joy or pleasure of renunciation, based on that, then one gives that up in order to reach what's called the equanimity based on the spiritual life or on detachment.
Thank you.
Yeah, and in day-to-day life, of course, it's just natural to choose certain foods over others, when one is faced with many choices, one can't just be completely indifferent to them. And I've complained, I've mentioned, I think in the past when I was in Sri Lanka getting Sri Lankan food every day, then I would think, oh, if only I could have a Chinese meal, a meal of Chinese food. Now that I'm getting Chinese food every day, if somebody says, why don't we go out to an Indian restaurant? Wow, let's go. Yeah, Stacy?
Yes, it sounds like you're saying that you can't get into the jhanas without becoming somewhat attached.
I didn't say that one can't get into the jhana without becoming attached. What I said is that, there's a tendency when that joy and rapture, pleasure and rapture arise, because it's such an extraordinarily blissful feeling, that the mind tends to become attached. I didn't say anything about what's possible or impossible.
And also,
You have to speak a little more.
what is the exact moment of going from being in the jhana into insight? Like, can you describe what that looks like?
First of all, maybe I'll pass that question up because it's not really directly related to the sutta. And I want to move on into the next portion of the sutta because I want to finish this today. Okay, now we come to the portion which is interesting and problematic. I don't know if you've read the note here. Because the text, the actual Pali text that's come down, see, I modified the translation based, let me put it this way. No, I'm sorry. This is quite normal and natural. This is to be expected. It's the next passage that I modified. Okay, so how is there agitation due to clinging? Let me write these words on the board. Okay, the word upada, this is a shortened form of the gerund or absolutive. You know what those words mean? Okay, it means it's the form of having done something. So upada is a shortened form of upadaya, which is having clung. There is paritasana. The word paritasana is an interesting word in that it can be based on two different Sanskrit words or Sanskrit roots. Either trish or tus. But you see, in Pali, we don't have these letters, the r and the sh of the Sanskrit. So in Pali, this root would also come out to be tus. The root trish means to crave. It's actually related to the English word thirst, to have a thirst for something. You could see thirst and trish. And from this word trish, from this root, we get in Pali the word tanha, which means craving. And it's hard to see in the Pali the relation between trish and tanha. We could see it more clearly in the Sanskrit. Trishna, you could see direct connection. But in Pali, there's another way of writing the same word, tanha, where you could see the connection, tasina. I think it's spelled like this. Okay, now the word tus, the other root, tus, gives a verb tussity, which means to fear, to be afraid. So the word paritasana in Pali somehow merges these two meanings of craving and fear. But in English, we don't have a convenient word that merges the meaning of both craving and fear. So I used agitation. I don't remember exactly the word that Nyanamoli used. I think he might have used anguish, which I thought was not satisfactory. Trepidation? Well, trepidation is related to fear, not so much to craving. Anyway, this is the sense, but here you'll see as this passage develops, you'll see that it's relating paritasana more to fear than to craving. Oh, that's interesting. That's true. Yeah. Okay, so let's see how the passage develops. Okay, how is there agitation or paritasana due to clinging? Okay, so first the Buddha uses the stock formula for the ordinary or the worldly person, in Pali, the putujana, the common person, one who has no regard for the noble ones, is unskilled and undisciplined in their teaching, and so on. So this one he adopts any of the 20 types of personality view, identity view, the view of self in relation to the five aggregates. So he regards material form as self, self is possessed of material form is in the self, or self as in material form. So we have four possibilities here. Positing a self in some way in relation to the body, material form. Either one takes the body to be the self, or one assumes that there is a self that owns the body, so the body is mine, or else on a more philosophical level, one posits that there is the self somewhere inside the body, or that there is an all-encompassing self, so that the body is within the self. In any case, one's identity, whatever view one adopts, one's identity, one's sense of personal identity, is bound up with material form, with the body. So what happens? The text says that material form of the worldly person, changes and becomes otherwise. This is generally referring to the aging process. With the change and becoming otherwise of that material form, his consciousness is preoccupied with the change of material form. My hair is turning gray. Oh, I look in the mirror. Those wrinkles weren't there before. Oh, what's going on? Now I'm getting weaker. Oh, in the past I used to be able to run 3 miles. Now I'm getting tired even after the first mile. Richard, did you? Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. 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 Okay, but that's jumping the gun. I want to go through the intervening phrases. Okay, so first, let's see. We have the consciousness is preoccupied with the change of material form. Okay, so now, the body is changing, maybe not necessarily just aging, but one is getting ill. Okay, I go to the doctor, he reports, okay, you have pre-diabetes, signs of pre-diabetes, or your blood pressure too high, or what is the other thing? Blood pressure is too high, cholesterol level is too high. It's not a laughing matter. And then, of course, what everybody fears most, okay, we've done a scanning or a screening, and it looks like there's a little tumor there. We have to do a biopsy. So then the mind is really preoccupied with the change in form. Okay, so then agitated mental states born of preoccupation with the change of material form arise together. It's a rather complex expression in the Pali. I won't go into it in detail here. But there's indicating like maybe a whole bundle of mental states can arise associated with that agitation. So this would include the panic attacks, So agitated mental states born of preoccupation with the change of form arise together and remain obsessing his mind. Because his mind is obsessed, he becomes anxious, distressed, and concerned. Well, as Richard said, it can go beyond just concern, but, well, really, anxiety. Let's see what the Pali words used here. Yeah, Uddesavibhanga. It's related to that verb tussati, to be afraid. So that's translated anxiety. Vigata is like distress, affliction of the mind. I think this is a Chinese kunao. And then upekava, that is, it's translated concern, a kind of attached, looking at the situation with attachment. Okay, and so in that way, upadhaya paritasati, because of clinging, through clinging, one becomes agitated. Okay, then the same pattern is unfolded or unpacked in regard to the other four aggregates. Okay, now we come to paragraph 21. This is the one that is a bit perplexing because the original Pali text says, anupada paritasana, which would mean that through non-clinging there is agitation. But that is sort of exactly the opposite of what the Buddha repeatedly teaches. You know, through clinging there is agitation, craving, fear, distress. Then get rid of clinging, and then there's no agitation, anxiety, distress. But if we look at this text, what it's saying, anupada paritasana, through non-clinging there is agitation. So what to do about this? When I was working, I think Venerable Nyanamoli had originally translated following the Pali text, but I thought this is contradictory to the teaching. It must have been a transmission error or a copyist error, because there's another sutta that occurs in the Samyutta Nikaya. I think it's chapter 22. It could be sutta number 7 and 8, which is exactly the same as this portion, and it has the expected reading. Through clinging there is agitation. Through non-clinging there is no agitation. The Samyutta Nikaya version has anupada naparitasana, with non-clinging, no agitation. But the Pali version has anupada paritasana, through non-clinging there is agitation. Wait, I had checked the commentary when working on this, and the commentary accepts the reading that's come down, and it gives a rather, what I call a convoluted explanation. It says, what is meant, I copied it here. So it says, how is there agitation through non-clinging? Then it gives the answer, through the absence of anything to cling to. For if there were anything, any conditioned thing which was permanent, stable, or the self, then it would be proper to cling to it. But because there is nothing that can be clung to, therefore putting it short. Therefore, because there is nothing that can be clung to, there is agitation. But that, I have to say, doesn't make sense to me. Then, just yesterday and today, I checked the Chinese version of this, and strangely, the Chinese version reads exactly like the Pali version. It has the same thing. It has Yun he Bixu ne shou Kong bu. Is that correct? Correct pronunciation? You understand? Makes sense? You're a Cantonese speaker. I want Bowie. Yun he Bixu ne shou Kong bu. Kong bu is fear. Excuse me? Yeah. What did I say? I said no. Oh, I'm putting in a Pali word there. No wonder. Busho. This is what happens to me sometimes when I meet a person from Sri Lanka and they start to speak to me in Sinhala, then I start to try to reply to them in Sinhala, but suddenly I realize I'm throwing in Chinese. They're looking at me puzzled. I'm throwing in Chinese words. Okay, but anyway, the Chinese text is exactly the same. It says, how is there for a monk fear due to non-clinging? But I still think what happened is that in a very early period, there was either a reciter's error or a copyist error before the two schools went their separate way. The Pali school, and then I think the Chinese version is based on the Sarvastivada school. So before those two schools went their separate way, this, I would call it a textual error, has entered into the text. Because it makes much better sense to take it according to the usual meaning through non-clinging, there is no agitation. Through clinging, there's agitation. Through non-clinging, there is no agitation. Okay, let's see the explanation. This is paragraph 21. Okay, so here the well-taught noble disciple who has regard for the noble ones and so on, does not regard material form as self, or self as possessed of material form and so on. So you see, not regarding material form as self, and that supports my interpretation. Not regarding material form as self is non-clinging. Regarding material form, the five aggregates, as self is clinging. So not regarding form and the other aggregates as self is non-clinging. Okay, so then that material form of his changes and becomes otherwise. With the change and becoming otherwise of material form, his consciousness is not preoccupied with the change of material form. Again, this is what happens when one doesn't identify the body as self, so the body changes. It doesn't mean one has to be a noble person, a stream enterer, but even somebody who has this right view of the body gets sick, changes, grows old, and one doesn't become preoccupied with that. Looking in the mirror every day, are there more gray hairs, more wrinkles? I remember back, well, still I see that, but this used to occur to me many years ago sometimes. Maybe it occurred one time when I was riding on the subway. Like a woman came onto the train, sat opposite me, and she could have been 75 years old, but the hair was dyed like a bright red, and the face was painted over with so much makeup and lipstick, like she was trying to look like she's 25 or 30 years old. And I felt so sorry for her. And I think this was even before I encountered Buddhism. But it just stuck in my mind that how a person is so attached to their physical appearance that they try to disguise the fact of aging. Okay, so the consciousness is not preoccupied with the change of form. Then agitated mental states born of preoccupation with the change of form do not arise together and obsess his mind. And so with this, because the mind is not obsessed, he's not anxious, distressed, and concerned, no anxiety spells, no panic attacks, no fainting and deep distress because of the change, but one can accept the change with equanimity. Okay, so then Mahā Kaccāna goes through the same pattern with regard to the other four aggregates, and then he sort of comes to the conclusion, paragraph 22. So when the Buddha rose from his seat and went into his dwelling, after giving a summary without expounding the detailed meaning, then he repeats the summary statement. And then he says, I understand the detailed meaning of the summary to be thus. But now he's going to give the monks liberty to sort of double check on him. So he says, if you want, go to the Blessed One and ask him about the meaning of this. And as the Blessed One explains it to you, so you should remember it. Okay, so the monks get up and they go to the Buddha, and then they repeat to the Buddha Mahā Kaccāna's explanation. Then the Buddha ends with a statement of praise of Mahā Kaccāna. Mahā Kaccāna, O monks, is wise. He has great wisdom. If you had asked me the meaning of this, if I hadn't gone to my dwelling and closed the door behind me, I would have explained it to you in the same way that Mahā Kaccāna has explained it. So that is the meaning, and so you should remember it. And that is the end of the sutta. Okay, if there are a few questions, we could take them now. If there are questions that need fuller discussion, then save them for after.
What troubles me is that if the Buddha has the divine eye, wouldn't he know that they don't know that? Why would he leave it there without a summary? And then later on explain, well, you could have asked me, wouldn't he have known this already? What I'm trying to say is, if he spoke to the disciples and he explained only the summary, not the exposition,
Yeah.
wouldn't he at the end know this already? What would he ask them? Well, you could have asked me. I would have tell you the same way, but you should have asked me. Well, would he just not explain it in the beginning? Like you explained before in the suttas, he's explained that he goes through it, or the Chinese sutta, he explains the exposition and summary.
Yeah.
So wouldn't it be more correct to say that he goes, starts the sutta, and explains it without having to stop at the summary?
Is your point that with the
When you
divine
said
eye, the Buddha would have known that the disciples didn't understand?
Correct.
And so he should have stayed and given the explanation?
Correct.
I just don't know the answer. It seems that since he announced that I'm going to give a summary and exposition, he should have given the exposition. But why he departed without giving the exposition, it's a puzzle.
Right.
One could say that he could have foreseen that the monks would go to Mahā Kaccāna and ask him, and Mahā Kaccāna would give a good explanation. But in that case, he should have just not said, I'll teach you a summary and an exposition, but he should have just stated the summary without offering to give the exposition, and then left. Or he could have given just a short statement and said, if you want to know the detailed meaning, go ask Mahā Kaccāna.
Correct, yeah.
So it's a puzzle, I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I know. Thanks.
Excuse me? Somebody here had the question. Okay, then we'll end now, and we'll come back at 12:15, and we could have some discussion. Oh, and before we end, next week we won't be having a class because we have the Abhidharma retreat. I'm not sure whether there are any openings left. Earlier this week, Jishu told me that 6 people had registered for the Abhidharma retreat. And I thought, how is that possible? I thought, maybe I'll just cancel it if they're just 6. But then Sam had checked with Kaidi, and Kaidi said, oh, almost 70 people have registered. And then Jishu told me later, she said 60. She had said 60, but I heard 6. Okay, so next week there's the Abhidharma retreat. If you're interested to attend, you could inquire whether there are still any openings. Better rush. And then the next class will be the Saturday after that, when we'll do Sutta number 139. Oh, wait. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's the 5th, the 12th. The 19th will be the next class. No. The 12th I won't be here, yeah. Okay, so we now end with sharing the merits. Sharing the merits to the deities, Dhamma protecting devas, the nagas or dragon spirits, the bhutas, the fair spirits, and all beings. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Pavagupadaya vichetato etantare satakai upapanna rupya rupicha sanya sanino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibuting. Okay, we'll end with 3 half bows to the Buddha. It's good to erase